Welcome to Poor Culture. Poor Culture is a digital faith community for the exiled, for people who are done with performance religion, but not done with seeking God. You are welcome here, exactly as you arrive. A brief note before we begin. Scripture emerged from particular people in particular cultures, speaking particular languages, living inside particular moments in history. Because of that, biblical texts sometimes carry gendered language, familial images, and cultural assumptions that can feel complicated or painful, depending on what you've lived through. When those words appear in these sermons, they are used to honor the text and its context, not to elevate one gender, identity, or culture above another, not to exclude anyone the text was never meant to exclude. The goal of these sermons is not agreement, it's honest engagement. To think carefully, to listen well, to wrestle with real questions, and to remain open to the possibility that God may still be speaking, even here, even now, even to you. So a few years ago, I found myself reading about the Apollo program. Most of us know the headline, America put a man on the moon. We know the photographs, the grainy television broadcast, Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface, one giant step. You know the stuff of history. What most people don't know is how much it cost. In today's dollars, the Apollo program cost roughly $250 billion, with a T, dollars. More than 400,000 people worked on it, thousands of contractors, entire industries. An undertaking so large it consumed more than half of NASA's entire budget during the 1960s. And early on, many people thought the challenge was simple. Build a rocket powerful enough to reach the moon. That's the problem. Build a bigger rocket, more fuel, more thrust, more power. But as the program evolved, NASA realized something. The rocket wasn't actually the problem. The real challenge was integration. Navigation had to work. Guidance had to work. Software had to work. Communications had to work. Materials had to work. Human beings had to work. Mission control had to work. Everything had to work together at the same time. The moon mission succeeded when they stopped treating it as a rocket problem and started treating it as a systems problem. And I wonder if that is exactly where we are with the artificial intelligence. Because everybody's talking about the machine. The machine is getting smarter. The machine is getting faster. The machine is getting more capable. The machine is getting more powerful. But what if the machine isn't the real issue? What if AI is not a technology problem? What if it is a systems problem? What if the deeper issue is not what we are building, but what we are becoming? Because culture, that is the mistake people make when they read Babel. They think Genesis 11 is about a tower. It isn't. The tower is the rocket. The tower is the visible thing. The tower is the object everybody notices, but God is looking at the system underneath it. The imagination, the ambition, the understanding of power, the understanding of identity, the understanding of what human beings are for. See, the tower is not the problem. The tower reveals the problem. And that's a very different sermon. Because Genesis 11 is not asking, what are they building? Genesis 11 is asking, what kind of people are they becoming while they build it? In the previous message, I said the crisis of our age is not that machines are becoming image bearers. The crisis is that the image bearers are forgetting the image. And I want to stay with that today. Because forgetting doesn't happen all at once. Forgetting is a process. So you don't wake up one morning and decide you no longer know who you are. It happens slowly, incrementally. You get busy, you get distracted, you get hurt, you get successful, you get comfortable. And one day you look around and realize that the thing you've been building, the thing consuming your energy and your time and your imagination, has quietly become the thing you're living for. Not the God who made you, the project, the tower. That is Babel. Not a story of ancient people doing something primitive, a story about what happens after the forgetting sets in. Sermon 1 was this: image bearers are forgetting the image. Sermon 2 is this: when image bearers forget the image, they start building towers. That's the through line. That's what connects every sermon in this series. The machine is the latest version of a tower, but the builders are the same people. Us. Now, last week when we discussed the first temptation in Scripture, I reminded you that the first temptation was not atheism. It was never atheism. The serpent never said there was no God. The serpent said, you will be like God. I need to bring that back here because it does something important to how we read Babel. See, when we get to Genesis 11, the serpent is not in this story. There is no snake. There is no explicit temptation scene. And that is the point. See, by Genesis 11, human beings no longer need to be tempted. They have internalized it. The project of self-deification, of building your way to heaven, of making your own name, of reaching the place where nothing is impossible, has become the default imagination of the species. No serpent required. That is the progression that Scripture is showing us. Genesis 3, the temptation is external. Something has to come and offer it to you. Genesis 11, the temptation is cultural. It's in the air everyone breathes. It's the project everyone agrees on. It's the vision that feels so natural, nobody even questions it. Of course we build. Of course we reach higher. Of course we make a name. Why would we do anything else? And I want you to feel what that means for right now. Because nobody is walking around telling you to replace God with a machine. It is simply becoming the air, the default, the place we reach. See, we used to take our prayers to God. We question something we would ask God. Now we go to a machine. It's the first place we reach, the thing that feels most natural. And the most dangerous temptations are never the ones that feel like temptations. They're the ones that feel like progress. So again, I have to ask you the question that lives underneath everything, every one of these sermons, every moment we are discussing. The same question as last week because it doesn't go away. Do we still remember who we are? Because here's what I've learned in pastoral work. The people who end up most confused, most lost, most willing to hand their inner life over to something that cannot hold it are not bad people, are not weak people. They're not even faithless people. They are people who got so busy building, so focused on the project, the career, the platform, the achievement, their survival, that somewhere along the way they lost the thread back to themselves. And when you lose the thread back to yourself, you lose the thread back to God. And when you lose the thread back to God, you will fill that space with something. Human beings cannot tolerate a vacuum in the soul. We will always find something to orient around, something to trust, something to reach toward. The question is never, will we build? The question is always, what are we becoming while we build? That's where we reach our text. I talked about this last week. Three things happening in this text that we almost always miss. First, the story is placed deliberately, and the placement changes everything. Most people read Genesis as a straight line: creation, fall, flood, Babel, one thing after another. But Genesis 10 is the table of nations, 70 peoples scattered across the earth, each with their own language, their own territory, their own culture, already before Babel, which means Genesis 11 is not moving forward in time, it's moving backwards. It's explaining how chapter 10 happened. We say it's filling in the backstory. And that changes the meaning completely. The diversity of people and languages you see in Genesis 10, that is not the consequence of a divine punishment. That is the destination God has been working toward since creation. The scattering is not the tragedy. The tower is the detour away from the destination. God's project from the beginning is not uniformity. It is a world made up of many peoples, many tongues, many cultures, each carrying a piece of the image of God that no single culture can contain alone. Babel tries to collapse all of that into one language, one people, one project, one name, and God says, not this way. Second, nothing will be impossible for them. That is not a compliment. Read verse 6 again. Then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. We read that and hear God worried about human competition. That's not what's happening. God is diagnosing a systems failure because the history of human civilization has confirmed over and over and over again what God sees in that moment. When power concentrates without accountability, when one vision, when one language, when one system, one project is imposed on everyone, when nothing is impossible and there's no way to say, hey, slow down or consider the cost or to even ask who gets hurt. What you get is not paradise. What you get is empire. What you get is Pharaoh. What you get is Caesar. What you get is every system that has ever decided some people are more human than others because they serve the project better. God scatters not to punish the ambition. God scatters to protect the many from the few who would build on their backs. And third, the naming is the whole thing. They say, let us make a name for ourselves. I told you last week in scripture, the power to name is the power of the one who made. God names the creation. God renames the covenant people. The name is not just an identity. The name is a relationship. The name is a declaration of whose you are. When the people say, let us make a name for ourselves, they are not just being ambitious. They are performing a theological act. They are declaring, we will define ourselves. We will determine our own worth. We will decide what we are for. We will answer to no one above us. That is not the language of builders. That is the language of people who are forgotten they were made. So let me put this together. We are living through the construction of the most powerful information system in human history. And the people building it are saying things that should sound familiar. They are talking about one unified intelligence, one system that speaks every language, one network that connects all human knowledge, one platform through which the world makes sense. Nothing impossible. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying the engineers are evil. I'm saying the pattern is old. I'm saying we have seen what happens when the goal is totality. When the goal is one language, when the goal is one name, when the goal is a system so powerful that nothing is impossible. The tower is not the problem. The tower reveals the problem. And the problem, the one God saw in Babel, the one God sees now, is the same one the machine accidentally named in last week's sermon. What happens when we forget who we already are? What happens when the machine becomes the thing that tells us who we are? What happens when your worth is calculated by an algorithm? What happens when your history is processed and returned to you as content? What happens when the voice that speaks most clearly into your life, the voice that answers first, the voice you reach for before prayer, before community, before your own God-given discernment, is a voice that does not know your name the way God who made you and knows your name? Because the machine can speak. Lord knows it can speak. It speaks in every language. It speaks with confidence. It speaks with patience. It speaks at 3 a.m. But there is something the machine cannot say. It cannot say, I know you. Not the way the psalmist means it, not the way Psalmist 139 means it. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. That is not a search query. That is a covenant. That is a God who was present before you had language for yourself, who knew you before you knew anything, who named you before you could perform. And no tower, however tall, however intelligent, however articulate, has ever been able to say that. So let me close. Because we started with a rocket and we ended up with covenant. That's how it works when you follow the question all the way down. Because the Apollo program did not fail when they focused on the rocket. They just hadn't found the real problem yet. And we, as a culture, as a civilization, as a species, are still in the early phase. Still asking about the machine. Still asking, is it safe? Is it smart? Is it dangerous? Can we control it? Those are rocket questions. And the church, the people, not the building, the one that has survived every empire and every tower, has been assigned a different question. Not what is the machine doing, but what are we becoming while we build it? Not how do we control the technology, but do we still remember who we are? Because here's what I know. Babel failed. Every Babel fails. Not because God is petty, but because systems built on self-sufficiency, on the illusion that we can name ourselves, that we can save ourselves, that we can transcend ourselves through what we build, always, always, always eventually discover the one thing the tower cannot solve. That is the human heart. That loneliness, the grief, the hunger for something that actually knows you, the need to be loved by something that chose you, not because you were useful, not because you were productive, not because you performed well, but because you are yours. And when the tower runs out of answers, when the machine, for all its brilliance, cannot hold you in the dark, the God of the scattered, the God of the many, the God who broke up the project of uniformity to protect the dignity of the particular, that God will still be there, has always been there, speaking in the language of the people the tower left behind. That is not a consolation prize this morning. That is the point. The scattering was never punishment. The scattering was the plan, because God of Scripture does not live in towers. The God of Scripture lives among the scattered, among the many-tongued, among the ones who never made a name for themselves, among the people the project forgot. That is where the voice comes from. That is who we are. That is what no machine will ever replicate, not because it isn't smart enough, because it was never made for that. Only love was made for that. Only God was made for that. So as I close, I know you've been building something. Maybe for years, maybe your whole life. And somewhere in the building, you may have lost the thread back to yourself. That's okay. The thread still is there. It was put there before you built anything, before you were useful to anyone, before you had a name anyone recognized. You were already known. Go back to that. Not the tower, not the machine. not the name you've been making for yourself, the name that was given. Remember, remember who you are. Amen. Ashe. Shalom.